the pricing system is too complex. I think that is really the most difficult part in the area of retail LNG. Therefore, I think we need a unified system around the world, which is easily understood. And I would strongly suggest that this system is physically settled because then it kind of somehow reduces the volatility and make it more user-friendly.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome back to Commodities in Asia on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is He Yiyong, founder and CEO of LNG Easy. We'll be discussing the growing retail LNG markets of Asia and how they differ from the natural gas markets of the US and Europe. Hello, Yiyong. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you could be with us here today. And part of that is because one of the themes that keeps coming up on this podcast series is that simply assuming that the commodity markets in Asia work the same way that they do in the US and Europe is often very misguided. And you founded your company, LNG Easy, to service an LNG market that's very different from a typical Western natural gas market. And I wanted to start off today asking you, what do you see as the most important differences between the Asian LNG market that you're servicing and the natural gas markets that many of us may be more familiar with?
Right. So I think to start with, natural gas market in US and Europe, I would characterize them as regulated utilities in the beginning, with price control and all that. And obviously, it became fully liberalized later, but it is still a pipeline network market with very little liquid, in the system. Liquid meaning LNG in liquid form. So that's kind of the main difference. And then we had the second wave, which is the Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Japan in the early 70s, they did deals with Indonesia to buy LNG on a long-term basis, mainly for power generation. So the logic is still that, LNG would be regasified upon arrival in Japan, and then they would distribute it via pipeline network to either, refinery or power plant. I think, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore has this model, basically. And then China came along. And I think, the Chinese created a very different model in the sense that, the importers, the market makers like PetroChina, CNOOC and all that, they sign up long-term take-or-pay contracts like the traditional LNG model, pond-to-pond. But they found out that actually the power plants in China do not accept that pass-through risk. So the power plant in China are still saying that, okay, I can have gas, I can have coal. It's price-driven. So basically, the line of sight that you have in a traditional LNG market does not really exist in China. And therefore, the market makers like PetroChina and CNOOC started to think maybe we should generate an alternative market. And then they created the retail market. Because if you look at the beginning of retail LNG, the CNOOCs, the PetroChina, they really play a big role. They start to have LNG fuel buses, LNG fuel trucks. They start to invest in LNG refueling stations to provide fuel to the vehicles. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that China is very big, landmass of the whole of Europe. And in the beginning, pipeline network is not well spread out. So there's a lot of corners where, you need to reach by LNG. So therefore, they start to, develop the trucking LNG market where, it can reach, customers all around the country. And then they start to invest in regas and all that. So This is kind of a kind of little well-kept secret in the LNG business, and people are selling, a lot of LNG to China, but they don't really know what China is using the LNG for. And going forward, I think, if we are talking about the population juggernaut in Asia, Pakistan with 250 million people, Bangladesh with 170 million people, Vietnam with 100 million, Philippines 100 million, Indonesia 260. The question is whether pipeline gas or truck LNG will become a natural, a way of things. And I picked a truck LNG anytime. So, is that okay for a summary for you?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really fascinated with the idea of the trucked LNG market. When it ultimately gets to the consumers, what is this LNG being used for?
Yeah, very good question, right? So traditionally, under the regulated utility model, LNG is used as a primary energy. So you give it to a power plant to make electricity, which reach the customer, and then you give it to a refinery or fertilizer plant, which makes other end product, which would be bought by the farmers, for example. But that is not really the retail LNG model because LNG is don't forget LNG is very different from a pricing point of view because natural gas all across the globe had a price range of let's say $0 to $3. Zero meaning there's no the outlet, no pipeline, so people are flaring it, so maybe even negative value. But then, when there is a pipeline, it can kind of get distributed. But it's still very much determined by local governments, such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia. They decide what the gas will be, the cost will be. And then in the United States and Europe, it's decided by regional gas hubs, such as Henry Hub and TTF. But LNG is totally different, right? Pricing wise, because it's international market. There's arbitrage. Whenever there's a window opening, you can ship it crisscross the world on a ship. So different pricing, different supply chain, and then different way of distribution. Because pipe LNG is easy, you just had a pipeline connection. But when it comes to truck LNG and or liquid form of LNG consumption, you need a regas station at the end. So as long as you build a lot of these regas stations and refueling stations, that is the ecosystem with a lot of trucks. That is the ecosystem where retail LNG can play a big role.
Right. And it's interesting when I hear you talk about this use of LNG in China and some of the neighboring countries, and the trucked element in particular, it kind of reminds me of the heating oil market in the United States more than the natural gas market, in that it's a market driven by the need for local distribution in the absence of a pipeline network. And I'm curious, could you go into a little bit what sort of technology and infrastructure do you need to transport, store, and deliver LNG within this type of a market?
Right, sure. So I think you're absolutely right. The heating oil market in the US or diesel market is a liquid fuel market, secondary fuel. So it's different from the primary energy use of LNG, like Japan, where LNG is just a form of transportation. It doesn't really serve more purpose than that. But LNG is distributed and it can reach all corners of the country. So basically, you need a lot of truck fueling points. So if you go to the Chinese receiving terminals, they would have 200 points. Massive, massive truck fueling stations. So thousands of trucks can load from the terminals. And for example, the one in Tianjin, run by Sinopec, I think that has the most truck fueling base, 200 of them. That's on the receiving terminal side. And also, there are a lot of remote liquefaction plants in China because, they are in the northwest, northeast, and so on. So, how do they get to market? By trucking. So, again, these local liquefaction plants had a lot of truck fueling base. So that's on the supply side. And then you obviously transport by road. And there are two kind of tools. Right? One is the road tankers, which is inferior in a sense because there's a boil-off issues and all that. And then you had the ISO containers, which can hold LNG up to 120 days. So you really don't have a boil-off gas issue. So that's the kind of transport medium. And then on the consumption side, you had the local storage tanks, regasification equipment, and so on and so forth. So that's a system of regas stations. And then for the trucking fleet, there's a system of refueling LNG refueling stations along the highways. So these are the technology, if you like.
And it's pretty surprising. You mentioned when it's transported in these ISO containers, it can be in there for 120 days. That seems like a very long time for LNG.
Yes, because it's designed to withhold pressure. So it's there's also important for the reason of reducing methane slip, right? So when you had a container which leaks, I mean, after 10 days, is no good, right? But 120 days is a very long time for anybody to figure out a complete utilization of the methane without any concerns on slipping.
And you had mentioned earlier, the important point that relative to the United States and some other countries where natural gas is relatively inexpensive, LNG in Asia is still fairly expensive, from $16 an MMBTU or more. And that's the international price. Domestically, as you said, it's regulated. How does that relative cost of LNG impact how it's being used domestically in these markets?
I think that kind of actually encouraged the use of LNG as a secondary fuel, because as primary fuel, United States has been able to reduce carbon emission by billions of tons because of coal to gas conversion. Since 2011, I think more than 100 coal plants in the United States have converted, right? But that's $3. So you mentioned $16. So $16 is 8 times 2 or 5 times 3. So it is a luxury for many developing countries. So that being said, so on as a power generation fuel, the natural competition is coal and renewable, and both are cheaper than LNG. Then, I think basically a lot of analysts kind of are not yet realizing that the LNG has become saturated in developed mature markets. For example, Japan used to be the biggest importer, but they are reducing and reducing and reducing. Many reasons, right? So one of the key reasons is nuclear plant restarting, right? So they had 33 nuclear plants, they only started 12. So there's kind of long way to go. So mature markets like that is not, it's kind of somehow saturated. If you look at the consumption pattern in Europe, gas is really coming down, on a month by month basis throughout this year. So LNG is expensive for developing country to use it as a power generation fuel, but as a secondary fuel, there's no problem, right? Because diesel, again, you study around the globe, diesel is about, let's say, 28 to 30% of Brent, worldwide. It clears the market. And then heavy fuel oil is 20 to 23%. LPG is 19, 20%. So instead of consuming the LNG and hope for a 12% Brent, which is not possible, then use the LNG in the retail side as a liquid fuel replacement is a better business for many countries. So that therefore, I think retail LNG as a liquid fuel replacement is the growth market going forward.
And as a liquid fuel replacement, where is it being used in transportation? What are some of the other uses for it?
Yeah. So I mean, let's look at the example of China, right? China is 365 BCM market, about 260 million tons of LNG equivalent. About 30% of that is LNG, both from imports and domestic liquefaction. 70% is pipeline. So that 30% LNG, it goes to a very small part for peak shaving power generation. In the rich provinces of Guangdong and Zhejiang, they had some peak shaving plants, small ones, 200 megawatt and so on. Very small in Chinese standards, but it can be a huge plant for the Jamaica, right? But China is, or everything is in gigawatt terms. So 200 megawatt peak shaving is very small. So that's a tiny part. And then you have the industries. That's the kind of main part because, like I said, the distributed enterprises. Like I'm running a ceramic factory, a glass factory. I need boilers for whatever. So furnaces and boilers. That's kind of a very good market. Off-grid market. And then they use it for a domestic sector, meaning what they call city gas in China. So basically, for example, the city of Beijing, they had winter consumption 7 times summer consumption. So the pipelines in Beijing cannot be sized according to winter needs, diameter, throughput capacity, and all that. So it's kind of summer plus something. And then what do they do in the winter? They use LNG to inject into pipeline. So as a peak shaving measure. So that's and then also in the domestic sector, distributed guys, like a rural village, some remote area, no pipeline. They used to use coal for to make a boiler for space heating, and so on. Now they can use LNG on an ISO container outside the village, and then all the village is connected by a mini grid. So everybody can use for heating and cooking. And finally, transport. I mean, China has 500,000 LNG fuel trucks, heavy trucks, and about 300,000 buses, which are driven by LNG. So that's a 12 million ton market, LNG. So, and that's a unique market because you can't really serve it by pipeline. That's a really hardcore LNG market. So these are the area where the LNGs are using. And if you look at Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, it would be a copy of all I just said, except, for example, in Vietnam, you don't need space heating. It's all very obvious, right? So, but they need more for industries because the national power grid in Vietnam is very weak. Connectivity is weak. There's a lot of curtailment, breakouts, brownouts. So it makes sense to do distributed power generation based on LNG, just like in a similar fashion where in Africa, a lot of people are doing distributed power generation using diesel. But it would be one of those categories that I just mentioned.
Right. And I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned earlier the major energy companies in China bringing LNG in, and then potentially in the domestic market, the price being more regulated, and then, often fuels trading as a percent of Brent. And I'm curious, like, in addition to the price level itself, how do you see the current pricing mechanisms and the available pricing instruments, the benchmarks, affecting the performance of the LNG market in Asia?
Yeah, so I mean the evolution of pricing mechanism, right? I think in France in the early 50s, when they've had first LNG, they are trying to do a liquid fuel gas substitution, import, and then they try to price it by gas. So that's good. And then the Japanese system is JCC, a cocktail of crude import into Japan, and then long-term indexation. So that's I think it served its purpose. I would call that OLNG, point-to-point interlocking contracts throughout the supply chain. Everything is interlocking. So, and then we are in the area of new LNG, meaning and in addition to that point-to-point system, maybe we have 45% which are spot-driven. No contracts, shipping is fluid, everything is based on arbitrage window. So new LNG is an addition to the old LNG model, just with 45% spot element. It's more flexibility, but then it also adds complexity because we had like JKM, for example, is supposedly a LNG price index rather than HH and Henry Hub and TTF, which are basically regional gas hub prices. And then you had long-term oil indexation. So, I mean, that also can work. Only criticism is that liquidity is very low. And also it is not physically settled. Because, as I mentioned, the Chinese truck LNG, the market, 28, 30 million tons a year. They are loading about 4,000 trucks a day. 75,000 ton, one whole ship per day is being loaded and distributed in China. That's a very liquid market. One ship a day, can you imagine, that's a very, very big, but, I think JKM is a fraction of that. So that's number one. And number two, the financial settled mechanism, I think is more prone to speculation because you can express your opinion without a lot of consequences. And LNG is not an easy commodity to deal with. I mean, as you know, because of the boil-off storage issues and all that. So that's, new LNG. And then if we are moving from new LNG to retail LNG, meaning how the small customers in all over Asia or in Africa, in Latin America, without a billion-dollar terminal, They want to use LNG. I mean, now the problem really arises, right? So, and LNG EC, basically our mission is to make it available, breaking it into biophysically, technology-wise. That's possible because we have done it. We don't need a terminal to import LNG, very big regas terminal. So shipping is available. So all that is available, but the pricing system is too complex because if you imagine I'm a 20 megawatt power plant sitting in an island in the Philippines. I'm using diesel at the moment. The only thing I need to know is MOPS in Singapore because I buy diesel at MOPS price and then, plus the shipping and then plus some local logistics. That's my cost. Easy. And then I can negotiate with the government for fuel pass through and all that because it's kind of much less volatile. Now, if I'm that same owner of 20 megawatt power plant, I want to change to LNG. Oh, I heard it's cleaner, lower emissions, blah, 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 and cheaper at times. But then I need to understand, should I price it according to HH or TTF or JKM or long-term oil indexation? And then maybe oil indexation is not available until the year after. And then, everybody insists to sell me JKM, but JKM I know was $80 and it would bankrupt me. If I buy $80 or if I pass it through the government, it would bankrupt my government. A fuel which is worth $10 suddenly it became $80 for, to think about it, right? So I think that is really the most difficult part in the area of retail LNG. Therefore, I think we need a unified system around the world, which is easily understood. And I would strongly suggest that this system is physically settled because then it kind of somehow reduces the volatility and make it more user-friendly, if you like.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you another question, about the pricings. You had mentioned, things go to $80, bankrupt countries, bankrupt companies. When you think about kind of the price points, one of the interesting things in natural gas is always you hit certain price points and consumers will switch from one fuel source to another. So in the US, maybe switch from coal to gas or vice versa. Are there certain prices that are important for the domestic market? Like if the price goes above a certain level, you tend to expect to see certain consequences, certain switching, certain curtailment of buying LNG.
Yeah, very, very good question, David. So I think, you kind of can rank the countries in terms of their ability to switch. And I think, true energy security comes from that. It doesn't come from a long-term contract. Because, I mean, as you know, if you sign a long-term contract with certain exporters in the United States, one day's outage, two, maybe, they may not really fulfill the contract, right? So I think, in Europe, it's apparent that 2022, the ability to switch is limited. And then you go to Pakistan, gas country. Gas is 44% in primary energy supply. Again, how do they switch? Because I had to shut down like 44% of my economy but if you go to China, they had a lot of depth in the energy system. They had hydro, they had nuclear, they had everything under the sun. They had pipeline gas import, they had LNG, they had coal, they had renewable. That system is solid. That's why, in 2020, they fare very well, and they divert most of the LNG to Europe and make big bucks for it, right? And then you go to Bangladesh, again, limited ability to switch because it was a gas country. India, always big ability to switch because for them, it was 6% gas anyway. And then they're so cost conscious. So if it's like more than $8, India stop buying. So India for a very long time, and it still is now, is a buyer for distressed cargoes on ships. So different countries have different ability to switch. At the moment, Singapore, we can't switch. I mean, we are 95% on gas. So, I mean, luckily we are rich. So, it's kind of that helps a bit, right? But, if you are Vietnam, you had, again, certain ability to switch. Thailand is very low on the list because it's a country heavily relying on gas to power. And then when the domestic gas is depleting, they had to import LNG and they had to buy because it takes time to build up the ability to switch to diesel, to heavy fuel oil, to coal, or for renewable and all that. So it would happen. And that's my fear, actually, David. The volatility in LNG is causing countries to invest in their ability to switch, which is really not good for the long term growth of LNG. That I think everybody should pay attention to in our industry. We should not look at supplying LNG as a trading activity where you maximize every cargo. I really hope that people can think long term because we had invested as a collectively as planet Earth huge amount of liquefaction capacity. In the United States, it's the biggest one, and then Qatar has this, North field expansion and all that. There's a lot to come. I think we should have, really try to reduce the volatility, all of us.
I want to come back to that point a bit, but I wanted to ask you, you've laid out so many interesting facets and features of the gas market, the LNG market in Asia, and the way it differs from what, someone coming from a US or European perspective might think a natural gas market should look like. And I'm curious, when you listen to US or European analysts discuss LNG in Asia, what do you think they get wrong? And what do you think they need to understand better about these differences in the market and how those differences affect how LNG prices behave in Asia?
Well, I think, maybe they're not wrong. It's just that, our thinking had to evolve like everything else. I think a lot of European analysts come from a gas background, and that's what they know. And, they're mostly concerned about how TTF is behaving, and they don't really pay much attention to the arbitrage and all that exists in LNG. So it's kind of parochial. And if you take that parochial worldview and superimpose it on LNG, I don't think it works so well. That's one. And then the second issue could be that I think under new LNG, portfolio trading has become a norm rather than the exception. Because in old LNG, there's only supplying. Is Bontan supplying Japan? Is Bintulu supplying China? 20-year contract, lock-in shipping, everything. New LNG, most of the portfolio guys, they make a lot of money. So I think, there's a tendency to disregard country knowledge. What I told you, why Thailand has little ability to switch because it's a gas to power, very heavy gas to power country. But why China can say no to expensive LNG above their truck LNG price, they would stop buying and they don't care. You can go to $200. They just ship everything to Europe. They're fine. This is country knowledge. And I think, in every product we market, whether you are Procter and Gamble or something like that, country knowledge is important. And you had to make a penetration pricing, penetration strategy. But what I observe in LNG is that everybody say, okay, if you are buyer, KYC wedded, you had the credit line, I will sell to you. So I don't really care what goes on in Bangladesh. I don't care what goes on in Pakistan. I don't care what goes on China, Philippines, Vietnam. And I think that is not how it will be done in the future. Really, because in the retail LNG era, you need a lot of country knowledge. So I'm just saying, maybe supplying, trading, and then we had the brick bulk, so corresponding to old LNG, new LNG, and retail LNG. In the brick bulk area, we need much more knowledge on country level, what works, what doesn't, and so on. So I think, maybe this is where all our colleagues can improve together.
And I wanted to come back to the point on volatility, because there's reducing overall volatility, and then there's also giving people the tools to manage volatility, like you often see in derivatives markets, futures, options. To what extent are those tools available to help people in the retail LNG market manage their risk?
I think the cost is too high. For the big participants, of course they can do a JKM and TTF. I mean, and of course a lot of people trade HH as well. HH is not so relevant for LNG. So TTF, because it's an arbitrage between TTF and JKM that decides the trade flow, right? A marginal trade flow. I think these markets there's quite a bit of liquidity, no doubt, but maybe a little bit. I would even say excessive. I mean, so I'm sometimes contrarian, not on purpose, but it become like that. So David, let me ask you, we had a unique situation where we had 100% fullness in underground gas storage in Europe today, a lot of floating storage in Europe, which is burning boil of gas every day. So kind of wasteful, environmental, not so friendly, but the floating storage is building up. And then you had, on the other hand, countries in Asia waiting to pull the trigger because they're waiting for price to fall. But price is not falling. Vietnam, for example, they installed the, on end terminal, they imported one cargo and they have been waiting since because $16 is too much for them, So, and the Philippines, likewise, they want to pay 10 cents power in Luzon. They don't want to pay 30 cents like we had in Singapore. So how do you buy LNG at $16 and make power in 10 cents? I mean, just doesn't make up. So we had a situation where cost storage is full, like this full. Yeah. Floating storage is costly and difficult, unlike crude, because in crude, there's a lot of storage available, tank farms around the world. And then you can just pick up a VLCC, fill it up, and then, she can sit there for half a year without any problem, right? But LNG, you can't do that with a boil, right? So extreme difficulty in managing the storage, no third-party storage, and then the in-country storage are full, but price is still so far above marginal cost. Why? Tell me why. Marginal cost is easy. United States is Henry Hub $3 plus $3 liquefaction plus shipping. So $7-8 is marginal cost. Now we are double. So if you study economics, we had perfectly competitive market, and then you had monopolistic market. I think LNG today, in terms of market structure, is closer to monopolistic market. So maybe I do not answer your question in terms of hedging. I'm just saying there's something to be desired where we need to bring supply and demand closer to a perfectly competitive market so LNG can really flow naturally. Hedging is important for new LNG players, all the big Japanese utilities, PetroChina, Shell, ENI, big players. But in the area of retail LNG, the new buyers and all that, I mean, it's not on their mind. They just want a commodity which is very good all around, but a lot of price volatility and a lot of complexity to understand. So how do we go to that level? That's, I think, the big challenge for all of us.
Yeah, and it sounds like, what you're finding is that the pricing in Asia that's out there might not be reflective of what you're seeing in the physical market in terms of supply-demand balances.
Absolutely right.
And it's trying to understand why that's happening.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like when you look at the current LNG market, you mentioned problems in volatility, problems in, trying to reconcile prices with supply-demand balances. If you were to look and say the future of LNG in Asia is going to be driven to a large extent by retail LNG, what sort of pricing system do you think that market needs to grow and scale?
Yeah, again, very good question. So I think, basically, two things. One is, I think, if people can give us LPG index price, it would solve a lot of the problems in the retail sector because LPG is the cheapest liquid fuel. LPG, and then you had heavy fuel oil, and then you had diesel being the most expensive. So, if people give me that, I'm totally fine. And maybe it sounds kind of ridiculous at the moment, but I do remember in 2019 when LNG price was very low, JKM was less than $2 in the beginning of the year. People are willing to discuss co-indexation, all kind of different things. So I hope all the, our friends in the big portfolio players, suppliers, they can consider LPG indexation. So I think that would solve a lot of problems. And in LPG is easy to understand. It's CP driven. So, it's we don't have four things to worry about. It's only one. So easy. The other thing is absent of which we can do a ship LNG based physically settled index. I think that would be a very good thing for the market.
And looking out, just as we wrap up, I really appreciate this deep dive you've given us into the Asian retail LNG market and how it's connecting. When you look out to the future, how do you see that retail LNG market connecting with the global LNG market and the natural gas markets that we're all more accustomed to on this side of the globe?
I mean, they are in China. The market makers like PetroChina, CNOOC, they created this retail LNG market. It's not new technology-wise because their truck LNG in United States, Tesla is using LNG for their space rocket launching centers. There's some trucking in Europe and all that, but never as a business that is of such scale and also as a business in itself. So I think, how do we had old LNG, new LNG, and retail LNG. I would suggest that the market pay more attention to demand creation because we had a lot of investment on supply generation already. Warren Buffett invested, in liquefaction plant, and then you see Saudi Aramco, trying to, invest in ocean, I think it is, which is kind of buying a portfolio of liquefaction assets. That's all fine, very good. You make sure that there is supply. And then where's the demand? And then the traditional mature markets like Japan and China. Japan is not growing. Korea is barely growing. Singapore is growing, but we are a very small market. So China would not grow double digit, which they had in the past, 15 years. So China would go to a 5% growth area for a period of time before renewable take charge, and then the demand in China, I think, will subside. I'm of the opinion that this would happen faster than most analysts go. So the market for the marginal in capacity that we had added in the past 2 years until 2030 is developing Asia, and then we need to invest in demand generation. The infrastructure that we spoke about, the trucks, the ISO containers, the regas stations, the refueling stations. Then we can use a lot of LNG. Every country we go to, like Pakistan and all that, I think they import more than 10 million tons of liquid fuel. In terms of, I think LPG is 2.1 million. Diesel, furnace oil, and all that. It's a very, very big market. Bangladesh is also a huge market, liquid fuel. Vietnam uses a lot of liquid fuel. So demand, I think, I call for more investment on demand generation, number one. And number two, as a bridge, better pricing system. Because, better pricing system, so retail developers like us can sell. And the customers had confidence of lower volatility and ability to hedge and all that. I think that would be a very good system if we can somehow manage some of that.
Thanks again to He Yiyong, founder and CEO of LNG Easy. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Join us next week as we continue our series, Commodities in Asia. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets. Facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.